Over time, these adaptations turn into the workarounds, and eventually those workarounds become the way that the work is just done.
This is Stepping Up Healthcare. Your host is Tack, and the mission is simple. Build your capability and curiosity to make healthcare better.
Before we talk about fixing problems, or even mapping them, or even improving them, we need to talk about noticing problems, having the eyes to see the problems as they are. Noticing these triggers and red flags isn't about having the answer. It's about recognizing that something's off. What is some work that feels harder than it should? What is some work that is dependent on who's working that day, or what kind of day it even is? At this stage, we don't need the solutions. We don't need the answers. We don't even need to know what's broken necessarily. We just need to be able to say, something here's not working the way it should. Something isn't achieving that expected outcome we're looking for. That ability to pause and identify the friction without immediately fixing it is a skill that can be developed. It also takes a little humility to admit that something is going wrong. But process, not people, is something that we're going to harp on during this podcast.
Why does it matter?
Broken processes usually start with gaps in the process. Looking at a supply and it's not where it should be, a handoff isn't actually defined, information hasn't arrived when we need it. At first, the gap is small. People compensate, they adapt. Folks in the medical field are really good at this, adapting to their environment. Over time, these adaptations turn into the workarounds, and eventually those workarounds become the way that the work is just done. That's when things get tricky. The process still appears functional, but only because people are filling the gaps with sheer willpower, tribal knowledge, judgment calls, and maybe just a little bit of luck. That effort accumulates. It complicates the workflow and adds sludge to the process, making it a real slog, and quietly transfers system problems onto our staff. This is where burnout starts to feel personal, even though the root cause is the failing structures around our staff.
Let's talk about some real-world examples.
A couple of real-world tips on spotting these gaps or red flags in a process. If the best advice for a task is, okay, here's the trick, that's a red flag. If people say anything like, well, depends on XYZ, or that's not how it's supposed to work, but that's a red flag. One that I personally love is when somebody explains to me how they do it and then ends with, unless something goes wrong. Also, you can do it this way or that way. Whenever you hear the word or, as in O-R, whenever you hear somebody describing a process and uses that word or, my ears perk up. Multiple ways to complete a task might feel flexible, but it often is a sign that the process isn't clearly defined or there isn't one best way to do it. And anything that sounds kind of wishy-washy, words like usually, kind of, most of the time, those should grab your attention too. Those aren't communication problems. That's the process signaling. So how do we get better at identifying these red flags? As I mentioned earlier, it's a skill to be able to identify these red flags. Like any skill, practice builds capability and confidence. You need to train your eyes and your ears. You listen to how people describe their work. You have to learn how to watch what actually happens, not how the policy says it should happen. And that takes some real restraint. This is where the principle of go and see comes in. You may have heard of it. It's not an audit. It's not to correct. It's just to observe, and preferably silently, which is also really hard to do sometimes. Go and see means being present where the work happens and letting the process show you where it struggles. We'll talk a little bit more in depth about go and see in future episodes. And one more important distinction while we're here. This point probably warrants its own episode all by itself, but briefly, not everything people name as a problem is actually the problem. Need more staffing isn't a problem statement. It's often one of the answers to why we have a problem. The real problem usually sounds more like we aren't turning a patient Q2 because we don't have a turn team. Orders are delayed because we don't have the staff. Learning to spot those red flags helps you slow down and define the problem before jumping to solutions. And that's a hard lesson to learn. And like I said, we'll talk about that in a later episode.
Homework time.
All right, this week I want you to listen and watch. Notice where people hesitate, where the instructions branch into that or. You could do it this way or that way. Also notice where success depends on that sheer willpower, tribal knowledge, or if it's just luck. Write down one moment where the work felt unclear or overly complicated. This is a great place to start. And this is our starting point for our improvement journey. That's all I got for you. Next episode is about value and waste. Hope to see you then. I'm Tack. You're appreciated. Let's step up healthcare.